Happens to the best of us.
Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by Op-Ed News, available on Pacifica Radio Network, on Progressive Radio Network, on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and at opednews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is Carl Miller. He's a pioneering technology researcher who has thrown himself into some of the most scary, hidden, weird, and important parts of the digital age to understand how our lives are changing. He's the co-founder and research director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, the first UK think tank institute dedicated to studying the digital world, and he's a visiting research fellow at King's College London. He's got a new book out, The Death of the Gods, the New Global Power Grab. So welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Rob.
And what's fascinating about your book is you get into how power is changing and because of technology. And you start off the book giving a really interesting history on how there have been different kinds of power and different ways of thinking about it. So start off talking about the story of Zeus and Cronus.
So Cronus was the father of the gods. He was the head of a whole pantheon of gods, a whole collection of different actors which were in control of the world. And those gods had children. Amongst them was Zeus. Cronus was afraid of his children. He knew there was a prophecy that one day they would overthrow him. So Cronus ate each of his children. He ate the new gods, but didn't manage to eat Zeus. And Zeus eventually rose up and fought this terrible, decades-long battle against Cronus and eventually overthrew him. So it's really a story which I thought was a metaphor for what's happening now when you have a kind of grand changing of the guard. One series of gods being overthrown by the next. And gods was really the best way that I thought you could actually kind of personify and really describe power. Power is a really important concept, of course, but it's also one which is quite hard to actually imagine or put your finger on. It's invisible and it's amorphous. So the way I really saw it was the ability to of anyone to reach into anyone else's lives and shape what those lives are really like. Whether it's through coercion or incentives or persuasion.
What I really like about that story, you left out a couple little pieces that are interesting. One, Zeus was saved by his mother, right?
Indeed.
And that evokes the idea of the archetypal feminine. And perhaps what we're seeing in the evolution of power is a more archetypally feminine kind of power that's more distributed and more accessible. And two, so many mythical stories are about a king finding out that his heir is a threat to him and attempting to get rid of that heir. We're talking Moses and lots of different stories like that, though. So it's one of the most common myths, really. It's part of the hero's journey in many, many stories. Just wanted to throw that stuff in there.
Indeed, and it's about it's about new and old forms of power or new and old gods competing, and neither of them necessarily obviously prevailing for quite a long time. And I think that's exactly the kind of moment we're living in now. Old forms of power, new forms of power, sitting side by side. And often, as you say, interacting between them too, sometimes co-opting and sometimes kind of using or exploiting each other in order to eventually do what the powerful have always tried to do, which is to maintain and hold on to power and make themselves preeminent.
Now, you start off in the book exploring the nature of power, and you talk about it from the perspective of Machiavelli, Marx, Arendt, and Foucault. Can you get into that a little bit?
Sure. So there's a problem that writers face when they deal with power, which is that everyone before them has had a different idea of what power really is. So you have to try and build for the reader this idea that it's an incredibly multi-layered, incredibly historically kind of textured thing that you're confronting. But you also have to justify to the reader why then it's an important idea. Why on earth are we dealing with and trying to manage and trying to use an idea which is so hard to pin down? And it's because each of those writers you mentioned, Machiavelli, Marx, Hobbes, Foucault, Arendt, and all of them, have each turned to power, I think, maybe with a different definition, but with actually a consistent purpose. And that purpose was to make sense of their own societies which were undergoing revolutionary change. Each of them was writing at a time when their own societies were changing radically and usually very quickly. And they each used power, I think, to kind of cut down through the kind of froth and bluster of the day-to-day to ask the really hard questions, which we always need to ask in those moments, about what on earth is really going on, who on earth is really in control, how are our lives being shaped now, and how are our lives being shaped in changing ways than they were before. That's what I think the purpose of power, or using power in that analytic way, has always really been. And I think that kind of evoking it today is to try and put it within that lineage and to say we're living through our own moment of revolutionary shift, and we need to ask those same hard questions those writers have in the past in order to understand what's really going on.
What are the questions?
The question really is well, I think probably twofold. One, how is power distributed? So who holds power, and how is it in what way is it shifting from some hands to some other kinds of hands? And is it finding new kinds of concentrations or new forms of dispersion? So there's a question of distribution of power. The second is the question of the nature of power. What does it even mean to hold power now? And is holding power, or is power itself finding new forms than it was in the past? And those, like throughout my book, I think go hand in hand, really, in parallel. As I go off on my journey and I try to understand where power and what power really is, I think I'm asking both those questions all the time, trying to find unfamiliar forms of it, and also trying to find it sitting in unfamiliar places.
So I'm thinking, like the preacher said, first I'm going to tell them what I'm going to say, then I'm going to say it, then I'm going to tell them what I said. Tell us about what you've concluded about the new power, the changes that technology has wrought.
Okay. Well, as I went, it's probably worth mentioning before I reached that, just something of how I tried to do this. So I decided that there was no way that I would ever be able to try and find the reality of power today from behind a computer screen. Power and control are often quite hidden, quite elusive things. And I knew I needed to get out on the road to try and find them. So I spent much of a year traveling around the world trying to meet the people that I thought were the best examples of it. And it took me to some pretty weird places that I'm sure we're going to talk about later on, from huge hacker conventions in Las Vegas through to cybercrime raids, assassination markets on the darknet, citizen activists, journalists, and so on. As I went through all of these journeys, there were kind of two things. One thing became really apparent to me, because when I set off, the question that my publisher had asked me to answer was, are we moving towards a world of more liberation or more control than ever before? And as I went on this journey, I kind of realized with growing panic that I couldn't answer that question. We seem to be living through a world both of more liberation and of more control than ever before. That actually seemed to best characterize a digital age. We were beset by this huge increase in both. And that really led me to the conclusion. As I kept going, I realized actually whether power was both finding new concentrations and form of dispersions, it was both empowering people that were living lives they couldn't have dreamed of without digital tech, but it was also entrenching elites and large institutions and states and so on in another way. But wherever I found it, as it had kind of formed these new kinds of manifestations through digital technology and online, it had broken free. It had gone wild. That was my main conclusion. Power had gone wild. So we've always tried to cage power. Sorry, another metaphor for everyone. We've always tried to control it. The bars of that cage are everything from the laws that we have, the norms that many of us hold, professional standards, public scrutiny, There are all ways in which we try and limit and control how power is used and how it can shape our lives. And time again, in almost every area of life that I saw that power had drifted out from those cages. It had escaped through and between those bars and was now being used in ways which were far less subject to the rules, to laws, to norms than it was in the past.
That's kind of scary. You're saying that the old rules and laws are being evaded by power today.
Absolutely. I think we're living through the worst crisis of law enforcement in the history of modern policing. The regulations subject on the people making platforms which control and shape our social and economic lives are somewhat less than the manufacture of pencil crayon. Citizen journalists are breaking enormous stories, sometimes with great social good, but outside of the professional standards of journalism. Anywhere you look, media, culture, crime, warfare, anywhere, you're seeing the same things happening. People are wielding power in ways which are far less rule-based. And I think that really what has happened is that much of our kind of moral and institutional architecture, which we've built as a society to try and control power, has largely been circumvented. It's largely become irrelevant.
I had a conversation with Tim O'Reilly, one of the early innovators in the web period, and he talked about how legislation is just light years behind what's going on the web. That Google and Amazon and all the big platforms, they can tweak their algorithms in a matter of minutes, and it takes years to get legislation to do the same thing. Is there any way to reconcile that, to turn things so that we can have some kind of return to regulation? Because you talk about in the book how regulations and laws are a good thing that we need.
Well, I mean, I broadly believe they are, yes. I mean, regulations and laws as they're written by democratic institutions are the way to oppose and limit power. They're the basic rules that we set up to say that, look, you might think I should be a vegan and you might try and persuade me to be one, but you can't hold a gun to my head and force me to be one, right? Like we say there are basic ways in which power can be used and can't be used. And as you see all of these norms and regulatory codes and professional standards dropping away, like you're just simply seeing power being used in ways which I think are far more abusive and perhaps also more liberatory than they were in the past. I think it is really scary. And that's also without even thinking about how the law can be enforced. So one problem is the law can't be written quickly enough. Another one is that even when the law exists, actually law enforcement agencies and states around the world are really struggling to actually make the laws bite. They cannot bring cyber criminals to justice in any kind of way as easily as they have other forms of criminal and crime.
And it's not just cyber criminals either. You talk extensively about the militarization, about war, and how the new war is not just about soldiers, it's about data and it's about communication. And talk a little bit about that aspect of it.
Yeah, right. Another aspect of our lives, again, which has more moved outside of the rules. So we've seen a decisive shift in militaries thinking about warfare over the last 10 years. Like a stack of dominoes around the world, militaries have each of them redefined warfare to put information at its heart. The line of thinking essentially goes something like this. Warfare changes as society changes. We're now living in the information age. Information is now central to society. How must warfare change, therefore? Information must then become and be seen to be a kind of area of where warfare can happen within, in the same way as space, air, the sea and the land.
Now, one of the things that I learned from Joseph Nye, who wrote the book on soft power and the future of power, is that power is a lot about influence, the ability to get people to do things or not do things. And you write about power as influence. And I think this is a big part of what you're talking about when you're talking about the use of technology and information in terms of warfare.
Indeed. Right? Absolutely. Yeah, I don't mean kinetic cyber warfare. That's been much better covered in more detail by others elsewhere. I'm really interested in a slightly different form, which is what we were just really discussing, which is how information is an avenue which war can be fought within. but it's all about the same basic objective of warfare, which is to achieve political outcomes. And really now, militaries see that the way in which you can achieve political outcomes, behavioural change, could either be through bombs, it could be through force and threat, or it could be through persuasion. And they, like every other organisation on earth, now sees the internet, social media, blogs, and the entire online ecosystem that we've built as being one of the ways which people learn about the world and through which they can be persuaded.
So, you're a Brit. You're not tied into the U.S. political system for whoever. What's your take on what Mueller has been doing, investigating the influence of Russia in the 2016 presidential election?
Well, we've been doing our own research into Russian information warfare operations insofar as they've hit Brexit, the UK, and now coming up, the fear is the European parliamentary elections. It's not just Russia. I mean, the evidence that Russia has been very active in trying to use social media to achieve political outcomes is absolutely incontrovertible. They certainly have been. It's everywhere. The evidence is absolutely everywhere. It's hard not to find it. But it's not just them, Rob, and that's the important point here, is that if it was simply Russia and simply one election, then that would be one thing. But what we're really dealing with here is a profound shift in all militaries to how warfare is being fought, and we're only at the very, very beginning. And it's not just Russia, it's not just Iran, it's not just Turkey, it's not just more autocratic states that are doing this. Every state is doing this. I mean, it was actually NATO and the United States, then followed by the United Kingdom, that actually rewrote their own operational doctrines first.
How did they rewrite them?
So it's very interesting. The operational doctrines of all militaries are available online, and they're essentially a problem-solving guide to how wars should be fought. And this is what I'm really referring to when I'm claiming that states have put information at the heart of warfare. How they see that information is not only a tool of warfare, but where warfare actually happens. That is right there in their operational doctrines. In the United States, it happened in 2008. In Russia, 2012. In the UK, 2014.
Was that in 2008 when the U.S. declared that use of the internet could be a kind of declaration of war, that attacks that were internet and cyber attacks could be accidental?
No, you see, it was, I think, coming from the same body of thinking, but again, quite different. So that was the United States military trying to deal with cyber war and trying to create deterrence for cyber war. But then this was completely different. This had nothing to do with an attack on a critical national infrastructure that any state had. This had nothing to do with making anything go bang.
This is more like the kind of stuff that Cambridge Analytica was involved with.
Yeah, it's all soft power. I mean, some of it's data driven, some of it isn't. But it's all soft power. It's about persuasion. It's about the creation of false communities online. In many ways, it's often about trying to make one truth more visible than another. It's a kind of rapidly expanding array of different techniques and options that militaries have at their disposal. In fact, they were learning, I think, from many political campaigners who I think were rather quicker to this than militaries. I think militaries feel like they're catching up, but every military in the world has pivoted towards this strange new form of informational struggle.
And you talked about algorithms, bots, and virals as the parts of this, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense they are. They're certainly some of the tools in this new kind of struggle. They're also, in and of themselves, just weird new forms of power, I thought. So
let's talk about that. I need to do a station ID, and then we'll come back and talk about them, okay?
Okay.
So basically, I've already done the ID for the video, so I'm just going to pause for 10 seconds so I can find the spot to edit in my bumper for the radio show.
Brilliant.
Okay, so tell us about algorithms, bots, and virals, and how they relate to the new kinds of power.
So, as I was traveling around, I was obviously encountering what I thought were strange new forms of power, which were largely hidden. in algorithms, it was often that they were proprietary, so they were shaping our worlds more and more. They were at the heart of the tech giants. No one could look at them and really understand how they actually worked. Bots were hidden another way. They were hidden because many of them pretended to be human beings. Virals were hidden in a different way because they often didn't. They were often created by a specialist agency, by professional viral advertisers, but it looked like it was a big, spontaneous, organic kind of upswell on social media, and it was nothing.
Oh, wait. Let's get some definitions. Why don't you describe what an algorithm, a bot, and a viral is for?
Sorry, of course, yeah. So an algorithm is simply a series of steps. In essence, they're very simple. You can use an algorithm to find prime numbers. It's a series of instructions. And they've been around for thousands of years. But within the last 50, they've taken on a completely different form. They've become much more complicated, much more powerful. Virals are whenever you see something going crazy across social media, you know, those huge booming messages that get thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of shares. That's something going viral. Well, that means it's infecting people. They use the epidemiological kind of metaphor for it because it's so shareable, it's so sticky as an idea that it's kind of, people see it like it's moving like a viral through a social network or like a virus. And bots are automated accounts. So these might be on Twitter or Facebook, or really you can see them on any social media platform. They might talk, they might move, they might share stuff, they might like stuff. They might look like a human being, but they're in fact not. They're running according to a series of scripts. Okay.
And how are they changing the balance of power?
So I think they are making power more hidden in lots of different ways. They are each of them's being used like both to undermine established power and by established power. Like virals are often a really powerful tool by activists, and they often terrify corporations. Likewise, bots have been used by activists and by those seeking to kind of embarrass the powerful for a long time as well.
Can you give an example of a viral and of a bot?
Okay, so a viral, well, what's the latest viral? Basically, anything Trump tweets goes viral. The famous Oscar selfie by DeGeneres, I think her name is, Ellen DeGeneres. Do you remember that famous picture? That was a viral. The picture of Aylan Kurdi, a young migrant washing up on the beach in Greece, that was a viral.
Right.
Those are virals, and they keep spreading more and more and more until they go around the world.
I know companies are you said they're afraid of them because companies, they can do a lot of damage. They can overnight.
They're terrifying. Yeah. They're terrifying to a company because a small activist group with absolutely no media budget can, with a bit of savvy and some arresting footage, suddenly make a image go all the way around the world. Right. And lots of viral activists, I met viral activist groups in Berlin, in Germany, for instance, that really specialize in this. They go after arms companies, they go after mining companies, and they do stunts and tricks which they know are going to go viral.
You know, any other strategies or tactics that they use?
Absolutely, yeah. There's lots of tactics involved.
Like
what? The content, first of all. So the content needs to enact emotional arousal. So within seconds of you seeing the video, it has to make you laugh or cry or scream. If it doesn't do that, if it doesn't really activate your lizard brain, it's not going to go viral. So they need to start with the content. Lots of their stunts are incredibly funny. One stunt, they went to an arms fair and kind of announced a new warfare contraption which was powered on eating dead bodies. To kind of thousands of stunned kind of members of the audience, right? So that they start with that. They simplify it and boil it down. A viral has to be very, very, very simple. They can have no nuance. It can have no caveats. That's regarded as friction, and that's the thing that a viral really needs to avoid. And then lastly, they do seeding. So they try and reach out to members in a network and try and seed the viral. They try and work out who they need to get that image to kind of make it begin to spread. Tactical media work, they call it.
Tactical media work, interesting.
Yeah. And it can be incredibly effective.
And what would be an example of a bot operation?
Well, this is one of the favorite tactics of, or has been one of the favorite tactics of states like Russia. But the kind of history of bots goes a long way back. But as they're being used now by militaries, it would be to try and make something appear far more popular than it is. So within the UK, for instance, we had lots of Twitter users, apparently either British or American, sending lots of Islamophobic messages around the kind of Brexit announcement in the UK. Basically trying to claim that Brexit was a victory for kicking Muslims out of the UK. Now, some of them were real people operating from Russia, but many of them were bots.
Now, when you say a bot, is this something strictly technological, or is this like a boiler room where you got employees pretending to be other people?
No, they're automated. They're automated, and they're very easy to make. I mean, I made a bot for the book to see how easy it was, and it took me and a colleague of mine probably about half an hour. Our bot did go rogue actually in the end, so we probably didn't build it well enough. But this is no rocket science. This is a page of script, largely downloadable from the internet, and then you can create a Twitter account which will go around and behave like a real person, or essentially do whatever you program it to do. And
captchas don't block it?
Twitter tries. There's a kind of weird new form of struggle or arms race going on where Twitter builds new attempts to detect bots, and bot makers try and build new ways of evading them. It's a battle which is being fought every day on social media.
Now, you talked about how the military is using all of this. Is it the conventional military? Is it the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or the Marines, or who in government? What government organization does this kind of stuff?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, there's no obvious responsibility for doing information warfare for any branch of government, really. It can be I suppose the intelligence agencies. It could be kind of more soft power organizations, kind of outreach and diplomacy style organizations that have to deal with attitudes and more typically kind of engagement with foreign groups. Or it can be, the military themselves. In the UK, the 77th Brigade, which appears in my book, is our information warfare.
What's it called?
It's called the 77th Brigade. I visited it for the book, and that's the British Army. Although the previous group, called JTRIG, which has a long intelligence name, which is kind of typically unrevealing, as these things in the intelligence world often are, essentially was the UK's online covert action squad before it was exposed by the Snowden revelations, and that sat within GCHQ. So I don't think there's any clear mandate. I don't think any government agency has an obvious kind of mission statement which information warfare would sit within. I imagine it's largely entrepreneurial leaders within government agencies that would seek to expand their form of work into this new area.
Now, algorithms are used routinely by all the major platforms. I mean, I have algorithms that I use on my website. How are they used in warfare?
I mean, algorithms are used in lots of ways of warfare which fall far outside of my expertise. They're used in lots of targeting and decision making. Within the bit that I know most about, which is, of course, information warfare, they're used to build more sophisticated forms of automated messaging. So a bot can be really simple, but it could also be really complicated. You can make bots which appear very, very similar to human beings indeed. You could even use machine learning and natural language processing to get a bot to answer questions which you ask it. You might send a message to a bot saying, "Are you really a human being? Are you sure you're not from Russia?" And the bot might be programmed to understand that and laugh back to you and say, no, I'm really a human being. Wow. So in a sense, bots are algorithms. They're a series of instructions which the account basically is controlled with.
Okay. Now you go through, your book goes through different categories. We kind of talked about warfare already. You talk about business. Tell us about what you have to say about business and power.
I see. So, yes. So, one of the travels then was obviously to the greatest, most drastic concentration of power that I think the digital age has produced, and that's Silicon Valley. And to understand the world today, to understand the digital revolution today, you have to understand Silicon Valley. You have to understand the very small number of enormously powerful, influential companies which sit at the heart of all of this. In many ways, one of the difficulties isn't simply to see that they're powerful. It's to understand all the different ways in which these companies are powerful. All the way from the enormous amounts of money that they have to the incredible brains which they bring together, the enormous kind of ability that they have to control our social and cultural lives, and the ways in which they can kind of direct, I suppose, innovation and technological development in the ways that they want. I'm no easy tech basher. I mean, in many ways, these companies have brought enormous benefits to all of us. And I think kind of much of the kind of social ills which we create are being blamed on them. But really, I mean, apart from the weird cultures in them, they're enormous, sprawling primary color campuses. I think that personally, the weird veneration that they have for the tech founders who only go by their first names within the Valley. Everyone knows who Jack, Jeff, or Mark are. The thing that I really try to understand is, why are they so powerful? What has brought Microsoft, Google, Apple, and Facebook to, at the time of writing anyway, become the 4 or 5 largest companies in the world? And the answer is this kind of new logic that the digital revolution has produced, this new economic logic, where you get networks and you get data. Both of them get way more valuable the bigger they become. So networks produce data. Data makes those the services offered more appealing to consumers, which makes the networks bigger, which creates more data. It's this virtuous circle which has shot these companies up to the very top of industry vertical after industry vertical across the whole economy. They're still innovating at an absolutely breathtaking pace. And I was really struck when I went in and spoke to people in the tech giants and visited them, kind of how unstable they feel. You know, you look at their balance sheets, you look at their revenue charts, and these are companies which don't seem to be going anywhere. But inside, all of their workers are told to move faster, think more bravely, think more courageously, break things, get rid of the status quo. They're innovating so quickly and moving into so many more areas because they know that there are innovative startups waiting in the wings that want to take them on.
And so what you talk about in the book is how these giants, you say they never stop hacking. And I assume that means that they never stop attempting to find new ways to disrupt.
Indeed. Disruption, that magical word from the Valley, is at the heart of all of this. There's no interest in evolution. There's no interest in incremental change. The watchword is disruption. That is what those companies are built to do, and that is what the people that work within them want to do. Yeah.
What does that mean to us, disruption?
So disruption, I suppose, to define it, first off, means a kind of an entry which fundamentally breaks apart the status quo. It doesn't develop or evolve the status quo. It comes from a completely different direction and breaks it apart.
It's a paradigm shift.
A paradigm shift is a form of disruption, indeed. Yeah, and what it means to us is, I think that we see like more and more parts of our economic lives becoming fundamentally destabilized as these tech giants don't stop and as Silicon Valley doesn't stop. So it began with advertising, of course, and really that's what Facebook and Google started to do. It began with books, with Amazon. But then Amazon moved into Amazon Web Services. It began to offer cloud computing solutions. It's now selling groceries on the street. Facebook's going to do payments. Google's doing hundreds of different forms of artificial intelligence applications that are going to apply to everything from, are applying to everything from kind of medical care to transport.
Driverless cars.
Driverless cars is one thing. City maintenance will be another. I think Medcare is going to be an industry which I think almost all the tech giants in one way or another are targeting for disruption over the next few years. And you know, that's what it means to us. It's going to destabilize a lot of jobs. It's going to destabilize a lot of companies and markets. You know, which one thing I actually took, I mean, as a Brit, I'm probably somewhat conservative on these kinds of questions. I'm quite Burkean. I quite like gradual change rather than drastic change. But I actually was really impressed and enthused and energized by the kind of by the thinking within the Valley, the enormous energy and the desire to do things in a better way and not be weighed down by tradition. So I don't think it's always necessarily going to be a bad thing. I mean, there is a really strong focus on the consumer and on bringing the consumer a fundamentally better way of doing whatever they want to do, get around, become healthy, and so on.
You know, I call the show The Bottom Up Show, and I got a book coming out on it. And I think that what you described as breaking out is really, the brain has top down and bottom up functions. The bottom up is like raw sensory processing. The top down is filtering through our higher our memories and what have you. And it sounds like what you're describing these tech companies is doing is trying to break out and to have more bottom up approaches that are less restricted by existing ways of thinking. Indeed,
yeah, absolutely right. And of course, as they do that, and they allow energetic young innovators within their companies to you know, slay sacred cows and shred convention, we will see many more different ways of doing things. But of course, in another way, that is causing that kind of bottom up kind of thinking is actually causing a massive concentration of power and wealth, because each of these disruptions is causing money to flow in unprecedented rates into the Valley.
Yeah. Now we're going to do another brief show ID here, and we'll pause. My guest for the show is Carl Miller. He's a co-founder and research director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, the first UK think tank institute dedicated to studying the digital world. And he's a visiting research fellow at King's College London. And he's the author of a new book, The Death of the Gods, The New Global Power Grab. So what I want to hear about is these giants in Silicon Valley. They're engaging in all kinds of monopolistic practices, and nobody's challenging it. Nobody's questioning it. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think this is extraordinary. The history of monopoly. The last time we saw companies this large or this powerful were during the last revolution, the Industrial Revolution, which created the kind of Carnegie and Rockefeller monopolies. Very similar story. Completely new way of creating wealth. Completely new way of undergoing economic commerce, seeing the rise of very large companies which weren't just dominant players within the market, they were the market. And that's what's happened again. Last time, political power eventually intervened. A series of acts defining monopolies were brought in, and those trusts were broken apart. The antitrust laws, indeed, in the US were named after and on that basis. The nature of the monopoly now is different. The reason why they're monopolies now is different. They don't have a monopoly in the sense that they are controlling pricing. Now, I don't want to dive too much into the weeds of the...
Well, but I want to throw out, I picked up the line that you said, and I think it explains it. You say that power in business has moved from owners of means of production towards owners of platforms that have become the means of mediation.
And exactly right, yes, as I say so myself, indeed, yeah. And that, earlier I said that there was this new economic logic, networks and data. And that is what has fueled the rise of this new kind of monopoly. So these new mediators have risen up. They have sat between us and retailers and service providers and all the other organizations which we actually engage with to do economic commerce. Now you use a search engine, or you go onto social media, or you go onto an e-commerce site like eBay or Amazon when you want to try and buy something. Those mediators have become incredibly large, incredibly powerful, and the reason they have become, I suppose, like what I propose in the book, a new kind of monopoly, is that when the combination of networks and data means it is impossible for other organizations to compete. So networks are only useful to you, the consumer, when they become large enough to have all the products on it that you want, or able to categorize the whole of the internet in a way which is very effective, or where all your friends are on it, where they might answer your ads to do freelance work, maybe if you're on Facebook, or where you know that you're going to have the product on eBay. And that means that we've actually seen over the last 10 years very little change in who these mediators are. They just get bigger, they buy up the competition, they ingest more data, they make their services even better for us all. They become better at knowing what we want when we search for something. They become better at being able to price things exactly the right way so that we can just about afford to buy it, and so on. They become smarter. And that makes it very, very difficult, indeed, I think, entirely impossible for other companies to compete.
You know, more and more, I've been thinking of MySpace as a reason for hope when it comes to unseating Facebook as such a powerful force in the world.
The MySpace example, I mean, it's true to say there are very large bones in the social media kind of cemetery. Very large organizations, of Bebo's another, have risen, High Five, Friendster have risen and fallen. And that does loom large. I mean, one of the reasons these organizations are hacking so quickly and innovating so hard. I mean, Jeff Bezos famously wrote a letter to Amazon investors talking about day one thinking. He said, every day we need to go into work and believe ourselves to be a day one startup. So the day that we start day two thinking is the day that we start to die. It's extraordinary how the emphasis that is placed on maintaining kind of agility and staying hungry at the same time as growing to be huge, that each of these organizations has kind of placed on themselves. But I don't think they're the same, to be honest. I don't think that the MySpace example fits today. Yes, it was huge. It was one of the most visited sites in the United States, but it wasn't one of the largest companies in the world like Facebook is today. And
dash my hopes. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's true. And the other problem, I mean, yes, it is a problem, I suppose, is that innovation is happening outside of the tech giants, and there's going to continue to be people coming from the outside with new offerings. And the tech giants have become incredibly good indeed at identifying and buying them. And each of them buys hundreds of companies a year, significantly valued, in order to bring that kind of thinking and those people in-house. I mean, they can afford to pay more than anyone else in the world. It's a very nice life if you work for a tech giant.
Yeah, I believe that big is a dangerous thing, and we need to stop it. We need to stop such acquisitions. We need to make it difficult and unattractive to make those acquisitions. There's got to be a way to keep small companies independent. Let them have relationships with big companies, but don't let them buy them. This bigness, this gigantism is I think, one of the major dangers of this development of unrestrained power that you're describing. And that's really what you're saying. You're saying that power has evolved and changed so that it totally is no longer restricted by the bounds of regulations and laws that we had in effect. And all of a sudden, incredible amounts of power, the ability to influence others, to change the nature of nations, of elections, of economics. It's unrestrained now.
Indeed, it is unrestrained. It's. I mean, the word I used for it is wild. Unrestrained or gigantism are two other good words for it as well. But yes, sometimes not only wielded, of course, by very large organizations, individuals can be incredibly abusive too. And, you know, there are, I mean, one of the one of the chapters, probably the most harrowing chapter in the book, is on an assassination market on the darknet.
Talk about it.
So that's where I found power most, in the shadows. The darknet, an encrypted part of the internet where anonymity is technically guaranteed. And I joined a man called Chris, a kind of cybercrime investigator or darknet hacker, as he investigated an online assassination market.
And you call that chapter The Power of Life and Death.
Indeed.
Tell us more about what you learned.
So Chris spent time probing and analysing the site. Eventually, he wormed his way in and then kind of struck a kind of enormous kind of vein of information, really. He found a way of being able to grab and retrieve all the messages that were being sent from the users of the darknet site to its shadowy administrator. His conclusions were kind of confirmed, really, or his suspicions were confirmed that it was not actually conducting assassinations. It was a scam. It was just trying to get money. But he encountered dozens of cases where identities were being uploaded onto the site, and really significant amounts of Bitcoin were being paid to have people killed.
What the next step is, it really happens.
Sorry, say again?
The next step is that it actually happens.
And one of the people that used the site then went on to kill his wife in the United States. Probably the saddest part of the book. I know the bit of the book that impacted Chris the most. One of the stories here was how difficult it was for Chris to get law enforcement agencies to understand what it was that he was encountering. He wasn't keeping this to himself. He was trying to offer this information to law enforcement agencies around the world. But, you know, darknet assassination markets, onion keys, shadowy administrators, it was such a surreal, strange, kind of arcane, unfamiliar world that I think that law enforcement agencies, or at least the people that he spoke to within them, just struggled really to understand it all.
Onion key, what's that?
An onion key is essentially the kind of way in which darknet sites are kind of identified. So in the light net, we have kind of DNS. We have a kind of signposting system which allows you to go to a particular website. That can't happen in the darknet because that's a very good way of uncovering who actually is behind the website. So they have a whole other kind of convoluted technical system to guarantee anonymity, which ends in an onion key.
That sounds like the kind of thing that the technology that Bitcoin is based on.
It's some cryptography, indeed, yeah.
Oh, man, I've got someone calling into me. Hold on, pause for a second. So is the technology of blockchain and Bitcoin the same kind of thing that is used for the darknet?
Well, they're both based on cryptography, indeed. So, and of course, they're both, in a sense, anonymous. So yeah, I mean, cryptography sits at the heart of both blockchain, Bitcoin, and the darknet.
And I wanted to get into, it's my way of transitioning to blockchain, because you talk about how blockchain is decentralizing power.
I do, but in a way, I see it as the genuine new kind of disruption that might undermine the tech giants. So, and that's because really, huge fortunes and vast amounts of control really boil down to the very kind of unsexy topic of the plumbing of the internet. It's to do with software engineering. In all of these huge networks, whether they're Google or Facebook or Twitter or any of them, all the pipes point inwards. The data and the control goes to a central point. It goes to the company that controls it. Blockchain, architecturally, is to allow a network to function without any central point of control. So you can allow many of the same services that the tech giants offer to be done by a network that has no heart. So you could create a social media platform that doesn't have a company at its heart. You could You could offer financial services in ways which don't require a bank to sit at their heart, and so on. And in that way, rather than a new kind of app or a new application of artificial intelligence, that might be the thing that really comes in to undermine the tech giants. If suddenly there's this whole new way for us to do the things that they can do for us, but yet where no company needs to sit at the center of them. So suddenly all the pipes go from pointing inwards to pointing outwards. And
the thing that I can't figure out is Google has literally tens of thousands of servers, and Amazon does too. That's one of the reasons Amazon is getting these contracts for hundreds of millions of dollars with the military. They've got these server farms that fill boats, that fill caves and what have you. How would blockchain pay for that kind of technology?
Well, blockchain wouldn't. It would be up to the network. So for Bitcoin to work, you need significant amounts of computational power as well, and that's why they created mining. So Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin's creator's great idea, was that you could create Bitcoin mining. You could mint new Bitcoin and give it to the people that were contributing that computational power to the network. In a nutshell, that's what Bitcoin mining is, and that's what his great breakthrough really was. So there are ways of, but of course that's a problem in another way, because that actually represents a new form of concentration of power as well. So you can have blockchain or Bitcoin, which is in trying to decentralize power in terms of who's actually controlling the network, but then you create enormous Bitcoin mining companies, which are paid fortunes as well, that contribute the vast amount of the computational power to run that network itself. And many say could actually cause the network to completely stop were they to all pull out together. So it's a strange old world out there, Rob. It's decentralizations of power on the one hand, and then new concentrations of power being created through those very attempts to decentralize power. I'm sorry I can't paint a clearer picture of it.
No, it's what you're doing though is you're at least creating a rough cartography of this new world that we're experiencing, getting us to think about things that most people aren't even thinking about. Like another thing you talk about is how data is increasingly driving capitalism. How's that?
So surveillance capitalism, as it has often been called, is the business model upon which many of the tech giants are based. As each of them came to disrupt an industry, they needed to bring a fundamentally better way of doing something than what was currently happening. And in advertising, that was to use data in order to better target people. So when Facebook and Google came along, they brought with them something called programmatic advertising. You don't need to just reach millions of people, they've told ad agencies and brands. What you need to do is to reach the people that you want to reach in a far more targeted way. And the way that we can target people is through using the data that we have on them. So, of course, Facebook and Google know an enormous amount about your life, my life, everyone's life. They know the things we're interested in. They know the things that we do. And profiles are put together by them and by lots of other kind of ad tech companies that brands and advertisers use. So they're not going to try and sell me a retirement yacht as a 33-year-old author. They know I haven't got enough money for one, but they might try and sell me. They might try and sell me accountancy plans for authors or something like that. And that was all based on data. So
how much is it worth? How much? I mean, Google. How much is the data that Google or Facebook has acquired so far? How much is that? What's the value of that?
It's priceless. I mean, it's impossible to put a value on.
So hundreds of billions of dollars.
Well, Facebook and Google are combined worth $1.3 trillion by my last estimates, which is more than every single publisher in the world, as far as I can tell, put together.
Okay. So
these are companies that would not function, could not make any money without the data that they have.
And so basically their value is because of the interaction of all the users that they have. That's where the data is coming from.
And of course, the enormous amounts of attention which they harvest. So the other side of the coin here is that with so many people using Facebook and Google, you're watching areas of the screen which they can serve you ads on. So it's another virtuous circle. They know loads more about you. They can target ads at you better, ads you're much more likely to click on or to convert. But then they also have millions upon millions upon millions of people that they actually can then serve those targeted ads back to.
Is there a way to democratize this? There's a whole movement of platform cooperativism. And then there are actually business cooperatives where employees own the companies. Is there a way that the users could take over Facebook or Google? Could it be legislated even because they're such monopolies?
I think it would have to be state power. I can't see any other organization in the world other than a state which really has the power to kind of confront monopolies of that size.
We've seen some steps. We've seen the European Union require that everybody on the internet make changes in the way they handle people's data. I mean, my website had to go through extensive changes in order to meet the requirement for the European Union by the end of last year.
Yep.
So there's an example there of how legislation can force everybody to change what they're doing.
I completely agree. I mean, and it can in the future too. I mean, you know, these companies are not more powerful than states. It feels like they are. It feels like, and they are certainly more innovative.
Get into that though, about how the territories and states are kind of shifting, and that in some ways the power is nebulously shifting from territories to groups and things like that.
Yeah, and yet another complication. So I also think that states are beginning to descend into the digital ether too. I kind of question whether states being, I mean, the definition of state essentially is an organization which has monopoly of legitimate violence over a given territorial area, and I wonder whether that's going to change in the future as well. But just on this particular point around states and tech giants, you know, states have control of court systems, judicial systems, and militaries, and that means that they can still pretty much cause any company that acts within them to do what they want. So I encounter quite a lot of kind of thinking from legislators here in the UK who kind of think that there's nothing that they can do. There's nothing that we can do as a parliament to try and legislate for the tech companies. And I just don't really think that's true. I mean, there's loads of things that should be done, not only could be done.
Amen.
Especially to redefine monopoly. And both the Competition and Markets Authority here in the UK and its counterpart there in the States, the fact that it has not acted over the last 10 years, I think, is totally astonishing. Mm-hmm. And it has to be getting far more pressure and heat than it is to be doing something.
Same here in the U.S. And maybe we can learn from China, which seems to be taking a more iron hand. They do it with censorship, but perhaps we need to do it in other ways in terms of controlling these countries. We've got to wrap. Anything you want to finally say? No,
thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for such an interesting discussion, and I really appreciate you having read the book and all of your thoughts on it.
I appreciate you being here. And my guest for this show has been Carl Miller. He's the co-founder and research director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, the first UK think tank institute dedicated to the study of the digital world. And he's the author of the book, The Death of the Gods, the New Global Power Grab. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rob.